A lot of people have mixed feelings about shortcuts. What you hear often, oh, well, that's just a shortcut. You don't need that. You hear this for prong collars. You hear this for remote collars. The idea of certain tools being shortcuts and other tools not being shortcuts has always been bonkers USA to me. Utilizing food in dog training is 100% a shortcut. It can be done. You can train a dog without food. If I'm working with a client and I'm working with their money and they have a limited budget, the behavioral issues that we're working with are very pressing and potentially dangerous. Just because I can solve a behavior without certain tools, does that mean that you shouldn't? If I can make it less stressful on the dog, less stressful on them, get them to achieve better results, I can be humane both to the dog and the human, and I can do it within their financial budget over the time of the dog's lifespan, so they're not 15 by the time I get the behavioral results, right? Sometimes I can do things. Hey guys, I'm Blake Rodriguez with Dream Come True Canine, and on this episode of Blake's Takes, where I give you my take on all things dog training in the pet dog world, we're gonna talk shortcuts in dog training. Are they a good or bad thing? A lot of people have mixed feelings about shortcuts. Sometimes shortcuts can be good in life, sometimes shortcuts can be bad, but what you hear often are that certain dog training tools are shortcuts in dog training. You hear this for prong collars, you hear this for remote collars, or what people might call as shot collars. Hopefully they're not using it that way. But you hear, oh, well, that's just a shortcut. And for quite some time, the belief in dog training was that the prong collar would instill like ridiculous fear in a dog and doesn't work, and it just administers pain. And the remote collar is the same thing, and like the result is just a fearful, scared dog, and if it's compliant, it's super, super afraid. Now what you're starting to read and see a lot of is, oh, well, that's just a shortcut. You don't need that. And it's very true when it comes to certain behaviors, certain tools are not necessarily needed. However, the idea of certain tools being shortcuts and other tools not being shortcuts has always been bonkers USA to me. Utilizing food in dog training is 100% a shortcut. It can be done. You can train a dog without food. There are certainly benefits, and you can start to see results a little bit faster in some situations where you use food to leverage relationship building, and you use food as a motivator to positively reinforce or negatively punish something. When you're using food, you can usually start to get results in area a little bit quicker than you would if you were not using food. Can you train a dog without food? Sure. A lot of compulsion trainers do that all the time. You can certainly get a dog to be compliant without food, but the way that they look when they're compliant, often you're gonna see that you can get a dog to look much more enthusiastic and much more happy about things when you're starting to teach behaviors with food. Praise and affection, right? You can get a dog to start to perform behaviors faster, assuming that the dog loves praise and affection. Wait a minute, you mean that I get that when I do this, all of a sudden the dog starts sitting faster? It's a shortcut. The reality is, if you're using the remote collar properly, very rarely will it qualify as a shortcut unless you're purely using it just to stop a behavior. And in some situations, you could be effective in doing that. But usually and typically when we're using these tools, we're actually teaching all the behaviors that are super ideal and then layering the remote collar over that once the dog's already kicking ass with those tools. So in reality, the fundamental process of proper remote collar training when you're trying to condition the sensation of the remote is actually not much of a shortcut in the beginning stages. It actually takes longer. However, the end result can get you more reliable behavior in off-leash environments. When you're looking for timing for things at a distance, you can start to see reliable behavior faster than you would without it. So the question that I have is that if you can learn how to ride a horse bareback, but it's gonna take longer, and you understand that with the saddle and the reins, you can not only communicate more effectively and possibly more humanely, just because you can do it without it, does that mean that you shouldn't? Just because there's a shortcut, is that necessarily a bad thing? Now, when we're talking about shortcuts in dog training and just rushing through things, shortcuts can, just like with anything else in life, can obviously have its setbacks and can certainly be detrimental not only to the relationship process, but to the rehabilitation process as well. So I think it's really important to understand, as for me at least as a dog trainer, where I want to take advantage of shortcuts and where I want to make sure that I'm not skimping on certain things that we shouldn't be taking shortcuts on. For example, if I'm working with a client and I'm working with their money and they have a limited budget, and the behavioral issues that we're working with are very pressing and potentially dangerous, just because I can solve a behavior without certain tools doesn't mean that I'm going to teach the owner how to do that. If I can make it less stressful on the dog, less stressful on them, get them to achieve better results, I can be humane both to the dog and the human, and I can do it within their financial budget over the time of the dog's lifespan, so they're not 15 by the time I get the behavioral results. Now, when we're talking about shortcuts, there are some times where fundamentally, for example, the rehab process, the board and train program, where it makes sense for us to speed through the process of teaching certain fundamentals without the owners being there, especially if the real behavioral issues that the owners are coming to us for with their dogs are things that are deeper. I want to go ahead and I want to teach certain fundamentals. I don't need to spend months and months and months of teaching the owner how to teach their dog. My team and I can get the dog really, really good because we do this every day. We're professionals, and by the time that we incorporate and include the owner, they're gonna learn how to do this with a dog that already knows how, versus me saying, what I'm gonna do now is I want you to learn Spanish, and as you're learning it, when you don't really know what you're doing, I want you to teach Spanish to your best friend. It makes a little bit more sense if you can start to learn Spanish and speak it to somebody that understands it and can kind of provide information as to whether you're speaking clearly or not. So when it comes to shortcuts in dog training, I really believe that it's not a bad thing. And if you're looking at shortcuts as a bad thing, obviously we have to consider the context. Is it a bad thing for what you're speaking about specifically? But shortcuts in dog training and certain dog training tools that can provide you certain results faster, more effectively, when you're as a dog training working with other people's dogs. Listen, if you have your own dog and you don't have super pressing issues and you want to experiment, you want to take your time and the dog's having fun and you're all good, experiment and have fun. But for some people that have behavioral issues of dog aggression, leash pulling that's preventing them from walking their dog and preventing the dog from having a better quality of life, getting a dog off leash reliable so that they can enjoy their youth and actually chase wildlife and roam freely and not be on a long line their entire life or like a leash. Like, for me, shortcuts in that area, smart shortcuts, I think are super, super beneficial. And it would be silly for us to not take advantage of that. However, be careful when it comes to shortcuts and skipping fundamentals and doing things like that. I think there's a lot of value in the scenic route. And that's one of the reasons why, if you look at our board and train program, if you go to our website, you look at our Instagram and all of these things, you can see that our programs are 3, 6, and 8 week programs. For behavioral issues, it's 6 and more. Can I stop something within a week, sometimes within 24 to 48 hours? Absolutely. But when you're taking shortcuts, sometimes, not obviously, there are some exceptions to just jumping into behavioral issues prior to taking the time in the scenic route to teach the fundamentals and these things, this is where the shortcuts are going to hurt you. So when it comes to shortcuts in the scenic route, just be smart about it and have a level head and be rational and take advantage of shortcuts where you can. Be careful and don't be lazy where you know you should be taking the scenic route. Guys, that's it for this topic. I will see you on the next episode of Blake's Takes.